The morning of her betrothal breakfast, 3 weeks into the Sussex autumn, Sibella Quardine stood at the long table of Draxhall and arranged the bouquet that had arrived without a card. White roses, a sprig of rue, a stem of late foxglove. She would never have chosen herself. Her hands knew flowers the way other women's hands knew prayer, and so she felt the wrongness before she understood it. A folded square of paper bound into the stems where no ribbon ought to have been. She drew it out, under the cover of straightening a bloom. The hand was small and careful, and not her own. "Do not marry him," it said. "He killed your father." Then nothing more, no name, no plea, only those 8 words, and the cold weight of the table edge against her hip. Across the room the Viscount laughed at something his mother had said, and the sound carried easy and bright, the laugh of a man who had never once in his life been refused. Sibella folded the paper back to its smallest size and pressed it into her glove. She kept her face still. She had learned this past year to keep her face still over a great deal. What she did not yet know was that the man who wrote those words had risked his own ruin to set them in her hand, and that she would not learn his face for many days, and that the foxglove in the bouquet had not been chosen by accident at all. Let her go back. Let the morning open where her grief had opened it. 11 months before the betrothal breakfast, on a wet March evening, Sibella's father had died in the back room of the nursery he had built with his own 2 hands, and the world she had known had ended without ceremony. Ida Vane Quardine had been a gentleman by birth and a plantsman by vocation, a man who had spent a modest inheritance and the better part of 40 years coaxing rare things to grow in English soil. Linden Row Nursery had been his life's argument that beauty and labor were not opposites. He had raised his daughter alone after her mother's death, raised her among glass houses and seed drawers and the smell of warmed earth, and he had taught her to read a plant the way a physician reads a pulse. He had died, the surgeon said, of a failure of the heart. He had been 53, and strong as a gate. Sibella had sat with the news in her lap like a stone. She could not put down the debts came after. They always do. A man who pours money into glass houses does not leave a fortune, and what little Ida Vane had left was promised against notes she had not known existed. Within a season the nursery was sold over her head, the glass houses emptied, the seed drawers carried out into a grey yard and sold by the lot. Sibella, 26 years old, gentlewoman and pauper in the same breath, was taken in by a distant cousin who fed her and reminded her daily of the feeding. To the village she became, almost at once, the fallen Quardine girl, the one with the fine manners and no portion, the one a sensible woman would not seat above the salt. She heard the verdict the way one hears weather. She did not argue with it. She pressed flowers in the evenings by a single candle, and did not weep where she could be seen. It was the Viscount of Draxhall who lifted her out of it, or seemed to. Cyrus had come to the nursery years before, in her father's time, to buy specimens for the famous gardens at Draxhall, and he had remembered the daughter. He was a man of 32, handsome in the polished way of men who have been told so since boyhood, with a quick, warm manner and a habit of giving that felt at first like sunlight. He called on the cousin. He sent fruit from the Draxhall hothouses, Hal's. He spoke of Ida Vane with a grief that seemed genuine, and when at last he asked for Sibella's hand, he framed it as rescue. And the cousin wept with relief, and Sibella, who had learned that the world offers a woman very few doors, walked through the one held open. She did not love him. She told herself love was a luxury for women with portions, and that a kind man was enough. Cyrus was kind, she had told herself, and for the length of an autumn she very nearly believed it. The note unmade, all of it in 8 words. She did not sleep that night. She lay in the narrow guest bed at Draxhall where she had been installed for the betrothal week, and she turned the words over until they wore smooth. Tay, he killed your father. It was madness. It was the spite of some discarded servant, some rival for the Viscount's attention. Her father had died of his heart. The surgeon had said so. The coroner had signed it. She lay very still in the dark, and tried to remember whether she had ever read the coroner's paper with her own eyes, or whether she had only been told. In the morning she came down composed and pale and said nothing. Cyrus kissed her hand and called her his quiet wren, and said the word fondly, as a man names a thing he has caught. His mother watched. The Dowager Viscountess of Draxhall, Lady O'Frea, was a woman of 60, who wore her widowhood like armor and her diamonds like a creed. She had buried a husband and a reputation for softness in the same decade, and had emerged harder and brighter for it. She did not like the match. She had said so, in the carrying voice she reserved for opinions she meant to be overheard, that the girl was pretty enough, and bred enough, but had not a feather to fly with, and that Cyrus might have done a great deal better than a bankrupt nurseryman's daughter. She said it again now across the breakfast table, smiling as though it were a pleasantry. Pretty enough and bred enough, she said, but one does wonder what a gentleman sees. The room laughed politely. Sibella poured the tea. It was the first of 3 times she would hear the verdict spoken aloud, and it would not be the last cruelty of the day. That afternoon the betrothal party rode out to view the Draxhall woods, and it was there on the bridle path where 2 estates met that she first saw the Duke of Avonhurst. He was not what the village would have called handsome. He was tall and spare, and very still, dark-haired, with a jaw that might have been cut from the grey stone of his own house, and eyes the color of smoke over water. He sat his horse the way a sentence sits in a law book, with a weight that did not invite reply. The party greeted him with the particular deference reserved for a man of his rank and his coldness, and Cyrus's voice went a degree too smooth, and Lady O'Frea's chin lifted. Tristram, Duke of Avonhurst, owned the land that touched Draxhall on its eastern edge, and the 2 houses had been at law over a boundary for a generation. He bowed with the minimum the occasion required. His gaze passed over the company without interest until it reached Sibella, and there it stopped for the space of a single breath, and then moved on. She could not have said what was in it. She told herself it was nothing. She was wrong about that, too. What the company did not see, because his face did not show it, was that the Duke of Avonhurst had ridden out that afternoon for the precise purpose of looking at her, and that he had spent a fortnight deciding whether to write 8 words on a folded square of paper and bind them into a bouquet of white roses. He could not, in conscience, let her marry the man beside her without warning, and could not in honor sign his name to it because he had no proof, and a duke who accuses a viscount of murder without proof is a duke who hangs himself and saves no one. He had loved her father. That was the thing none of them knew. Edivane Quardine had been the only man in the county who had spoken to the Duke as a man, and not as a rank. And the Duke had grieved him in the silent, walled-up way. He grieved everything, and had begun quietly and alone to ask how a man, strong as a gate, dies of his heart in a single wet night. The party rode on. The Duke turned his horse for home. As Sibella passed him on the narrow path, their eyes met again, and this time he held it half a second longer than coldness allowed, and into that half-second he put everything he could not say. She did not understand it. She carried it home like a coal in her glove. All the same, in the days that followed she began, very quietly, to look. She had no fortune, and no standing, and no power of any kind, but she had the one inheritance the debts could not sell, which was the knowledge. In her own 2 hands, she knew plants. She knew, as her father had known, that the line between a medicine and a poison is only a question of quantity, and that the most ladylike flower in an English garden is also the deadliest foxglove. Digitalis, a tea of its leaves will quiet a racing heart, and a little more will stop it. And a physician who did not know to look will write down a failure of the heart and bury the question with the man. She thought of the foxglove in the bouquet. She thought of her father's heart. She went on the pretext of visiting her father's grave to the village where Lindenrow had stood, and sought out the old clerk who had kept her father's accounts, a stooped and careful man named Mr. Riddin. Hessam, who had loved Edivane and wept openly at the sale. She found him in his low cottage with his ledgers stacked to the rafters, and sat with him over weak tea, and let him tell her how it had been at the end. He had been there, he said. The night her father died, he had been in the front room going over the spring orders, and a gentleman had called late, after dark, in the rain. He had not seen the gentleman's face. He had heard the voice, low and pleasant, heard her father welcome him as a friend and bring out the brandy, and the two of them had gone into the back room and shut the door. Mr. Rapp Hessam had worked an hour and let himself out, the visitor's horse still tethered in the yard. In the morning, her father was dead in his chair, and the visitor was gone, and no one had thought to ask who he had been, because a man dies of his heart, and that is the end of it. Sibella sat very still. "Whose horse?" she asked. He did not know. "A good horse." He said, "A gentleman's horse." She asked him then the question she had not let herself ask anyone. Had there been a cup? Mr. Hessam thought. "2 glasses," he said, "for the brandy, and a third thing on the table, a little draught in a vial, which he had taken for the heart physic her father had lately begun to keep, for he had complained that winter, of his pulse running fast of an evening. The doctor had given him drops for it." "What doctor?" she asked. "A new man," Mr. Hessam said, "sent kindly by a great house." The Viscount had recommended him, out of friendship, when Edivane mentioned the trouble with his heart. The room seemed to tilt. Sibella set down her cup before it could betray her hands. A racing hard drop sent by the friend of a great house, a foxglove in a bouquet 11 months later, a folded note in a stranger's careful hand. She did not have proof. She had a shape, and the shape had Cyrus's smiling face at the center of it. She returned to Draxhall and went on pouring the tea. Now you should know what kind of woman she was, because everything that follows depends on it. She did not run to the magistrate with a grieving daughter's certainty, for she had grown up watching the law, and knew exactly how much weight it gave the word of a portionless girl against the word of a viscount. She did not faint, or accuse, or weep at the breakfast table. She decided instead to be sure, and then to be undeniable, and she began to gather the small, true things that even a viscount could not laugh away. She needed 3 things. She reckoned the doctor's name and his order book, the coroner's paper she had never read, and the vial itself, if it still existed. All 3 were guarded by people who did not yet know she was looking, and that ignorance was the only advantage she had. She meant to keep it. The doctor proved the easiest and the most chilling. She found in the Draxhall still-room where the household physic was kept, an apothecary's order book bound in green, and in it, in a clerk's neat hand, an order placed by the Viscount of Draxhall, near 3 years past, for a quantity of digitalis tincture far beyond what any single household could want. She did not take the book. She copied the entry onto the inside of her glove with a pencil. The date, and the quantity, and the apothecary's name, Mr. Larrow of Chichester, and put the book back exactly as it had lain, spine out, 3rd from the left. Then she made a mistake, and the mistake taught her how dangerous the people around her truly were. She asked Lady O'Frea lightly, over the embroidery they shared in the long afternoons, whether the household had a regular apothecary, for she had a headache and wished for a powder. The dowager looked up from her needle. She did not answer the question. She held her son's betrothed in a long, bright stare, and said, in a voice pitched to be overheard, that a young woman who married into a great house would do well to leave the running of its still-room to those who understood it, and to occupy herself with her own small affairs. It was the second voicing of the verdict, and it was sharper than the first, and it was, Sibella understood, a warning. The dowager had not survived her own decades by failing to notice when a quiet girl began to ask questions in the wrong rooms. From that afternoon a maid attended Sibella everywhere, a hard-faced woman named Snell who never quite met her eye, and the still-room door was found locked when before it had stood open, and Sibella understood that she was now watched. She nearly despaired. She walked out alone to the edge of the Draxhall woods where the bridle path crossed onto Avonhurst land, the only place she could be sure no Draxhall ear was near, and stood among the bare autumn trees, and let herself for 1/4 of an hour be afraid. The Duke of Avonhurst found her there. He came on foot, leading his horse, and stopped a proper distance from her, and did not bow with the minimum this time, but with something fuller, and when he spoke, his voice was low and level and entirely unlike the bright, warm voice of the man she was promised to. "Miss Quardine," he said, "you found the note." She looked at him a long moment across the cold air. "You wrote it," she said. It was not a question. "I wrote it," he said. "I could not sign it. A man in my position who names another without proof destroys the woman he meant to save, and I had no proof to give you, only the certainty of a friend. You knew my father." "I knew your father," he said, and for the first time something moved. In the gray stillness of his face, a crack the width of a hair, he spoke to me as though I were a person. When he died of his heart, I did not believe it, because I had walked his glass houses with him a fortnight before, and his heart was as sound as mine. I have spent 11 months asking why the doctor was sent by Draxhall. The drops were digitalis, and the Viscount had reason, for your father held a note of hand against the Draxhall woods. The boundary my house has gone to law over for 30 years, and at his death, that note passed into the debts, and the debts were bought up cheap by a Draxhall agent, and the boundary your father might have testified to was buried with him. Sibella stood very still. "So it was the land," she said. "It is always the land." He said, and then, "He is a man who likes to win, and your father had won once in open court on the question of a single oak. Cyrus does not forget an oak." She told him then what she had found, the order book, and the quantity, and the apothecary at Chichester. The third glass and the vial that Mr. Hessam remembered, and the doctor recommended out of friendship to a man whose heart had begun that winter to race in the evenings. The Duke listened, without moving. When she had finished, he was silent a while, and then he said the thing that changed everything. "Then they sent the drops slowly," he said, "over a winter. A little digitalis each evening to set the heart racing, so that a racing heart should be on record, so that a physician should expect it, so that when the larger dose came in the brandy on a wet March night it should look like the failure everyone was already prepared to believe. It was not done in a moment. It was done in patience. And patience, Miss Quardine, leaves a paper trail. She had not, until that moment, fully understood what had been done to her father. She understood it now, and the understanding took the strength from her knees, and the Duke crossed the distance between them, and put a hand beneath her elbow. Not an embrace, only a steadiness, and she let herself be steadied for 3 breaths, and then stood on her own. "We will need the coroner's paper," she said when she could speak, "and the apothecary's own record. And the vial, if it survived. They have locked the still room against me. Then we will not get it through the still room," he said. "The apothecary answers to coin and to law, not to Draxhall. I can reach him. The coroner's paper is filed at the county town, and any man may read it who knows to ask the vial." He paused. "The vial they will have destroyed if they are wise." "They were wise about most things," Sibella said. "They kept the order book 3 years all the same. People who win too easily grow careless about the small things they think no one will ever look at." Something almost like respect moved in the smoke-colored eyes. "We will see," he said. They parted on the path, and neither of them was foolish enough to be seen together again. So the gathering of the proof was done at a distance, through Mr. Metty, all. Hessam, who carried letters, and through a clerk of the Duke's who rode to Chichester, in the 10 days that remained before the wedding, which had been set, at the Dowager's brisk insistence, for the last Saturday of the month. The apothecary at Chichester remembered the order. He was an honest man, frightened of the law, and when the Duke's clerk laid the question plainly before him, he produced his own copy of the entry in his own book with his own hand, matching to the day the entry Sibella had copied onto her glove. He remembered, too, that the tincture had been collected not by a doctor, but by a Draxhall groom, the same groom across 3 winter months, a little at a time. He gave a sworn statement before a magistrate, his hand shaking, and it was sealed and carried away. The coroner's paper was worse and better. The Duke read it himself, in the cold record office of the county town. It named the cause as a failure of the heart, as she had been told. It also named the physician who had attended the body, and the physician was not the local surgeon who had spoken to Sibella at the time. It was the new man, the one sent kindly by a great house. And the coroner who had signed it had since died, and the new coroner was a younger man with no debt to Draxhall and a great care for his office. And when the Duke laid the apothecary's sworn statement beside the record he had signed in good faith on another man's word, the young coroner went very pale and said that this was a matter for an inquest reopened, and that he would order the grave examined. Sibella, when word reached her through Mr. Hessam, sat alone and shook, and did not know whether it was grief or triumph, and decided it did not matter, and that her father was owed both. The Draxhalls were not idle in those 10 days. Sibella had begun in the small hopefulness of the gathering proof to think of Cyrus as a man already beaten, and in this she had let herself hope too far. He was not beaten. He had killed once with patience, and meant to keep what the killing had bought, and he had not survived this far by failing to notice when the ground shifted under him. He noticed the clerk writing to Chichester. He noticed the letters Mr. Ended Hessam carried. He had eyes in the county town, as his mother had eyes in her own house, and when word reached him that a young coroner had been asking after a green order book and an old apothecary's record, the Viscount of Draxhall stopped smiling. The order book vanished from the still-room. Sibella found the shelf bare, when at last, on a pretext, she got the maid Snell out of the corridor long enough to try the lock with a pin her father had taught her to use on seed cabinets. Third from the left, spine out, and it was gone, and so was every other paper that might have damned them. She stood in the locked still-room, with her heart going like a hammer, and understood that they had moved first. It was worse than that. The apothecary at Chichester received the following day a visit from a Draxhall man who reminded him pleasantly of certain irregularities in his own license and how easily a tradesman might lose his living. The honest, frightened man wrote at once to the Duke's clerk to say he could not after all swear to anything, that he had been mistaken, that his book showed no such order, and that he wished to be left in peace. And the dowager, Lady O'Frea, who missed nothing, summoned Sibella to her dressing-room on the Thursday before the wedding, and dismissed the maids, and stood very straight in her diamonds, and said the thing plainly for the first time. She said she did not know what the girl imagined she had found, scratching about the still-room in the village like a hen, but that she would say this once. Edivane Quardine had died of his heart. The coroner had signed it. Any other story was the invention of a portionless girl made giddy by good fortune, and if such a story were ever spoken aloud, the girl would find herself returned to her cousin's charity within the hour, with her name in tatters, married to no one, believed by no one. And no duke, nor magistrate, nor God would take the word of a bankrupt's daughter over the word of the house of Draxhall. "Marry, my son," she said, "and hold your tongue, and be grateful. That is the whole of your future. There is no other." It was the third voicing of the verdict, and it came in the gathering dark of the dressing-room, and it was meant to break her, and very nearly it did. For here was the truth Sibella faced that night, alone in the narrow bed with the wedding 2 days off. The order book was gone. The apothecary had recanted. Her one ally was a man who could not be seen with her, whose own house was suspect for its quarrel over the very boundary the murder had bought. She had a copy of an entry on the inside of a glove, which any clever man would call a forgery, in a jealous girl's hand. She had the memory of an old clerk who had not seen a face. And she had a wedding, in 2 days after which she would be the wife of the man who had poisoned her father by patient inches across a winter, and would belong to him in law, and could be silenced for the rest of her life behind the walls of his house. She wept then, once, hard and silent, with her fist against her mouth, so that Snell in the corridor should not hear. Then she stopped, and washed her face in the cold water of the basin, and thought. They had taken the order book because they feared it. They had frightened the apothecary because they feared his record. They were afraid. A man who is winning does not bother to hide the small things. They were hiding everything, which meant they were not winning, which meant there was something left to lose. And the only thing left, the one thing they could not reach because they did not know it existed, was the vial. Mr. Hessam had seen a third thing on the table, a little draught in a vial, the night her father died. The Draxhalls did not know that anyone had seen it. They had been careful about the doctor and the order book and the coroner, the visible machinery of it, but they had not known that an old clerk, going over spring orders in the front room, had glimpsed, through a door left ajar, a small glass vial on his master's table beside the brandy. If that vial had survived, if, in the chaos of a death and a sale and the carrying out of a man's whole life into a grey yard, one small glass thing had been overlooked, she knew where her father kept the small glass things. She had emptied those drawers herself, weeping, the week of the sale, not looking for poison then, but for somewhere to put her grief. The seed drawers had been sold by the lot. Her father's personal cabinet, though the narrow walnut one with the brass pulls where he kept his current physic and his pen and his spectacles, that had not been sold. Mr. Purston, Hessam had taken it. She remembered now, had asked for it as a keepsake of his master, and been granted it, and it stood in his low cottage still, among the ledgers to the rafters, and she had drunk weak tea 3 feet from it, and not known. She sent word to Mr. Hessam by the only safe hand, a village child, paid a penny, to open the narrow walnut cabinet and look in the small drawer behind the spectacle case. She did not say what she hoped for. She did not dare put it in writing. The answer came back. The next morning, the day before the wedding, folded small in the same penny child's grubby fist. Mr. Gain. Hessam had found behind the spectacle case in the drawer her father had used for the day's physic, a small glass vial stoppered with wax, a third full of a brown liquid gone slightly cloudy with age, and bound to it with a thread, in her father's own unmistakable hand, a square of paper that read, "Drops from the new man. I shall not take more. Ask Avonhurst what he makes of it." Her father had suspected. At the very end he had set the vial aside and named one man in the county he trusted to make sense of it, and had died before he could carry it the half-day's ride to Avonhurst Park. The vial had sat in a dead man's cabinet in a poor clerk's cottage all that year, untouched, unguarded, because the people who would have destroyed it did not know it had ever been kept apart. Sibella read the penny child's message, standing in the cold Draxhall garden, and she did not weep, and she did not faint. She folded it into her glove beside the copied entry, and lifted her face to the grey autumn sky, and for the first time in 11 months she felt her father's hand on her shoulder, as surely as if he stood behind her. She got the vial to the Duke that same day, by Mr. Hessam's own hand, who rode the half-day to Avonhurst Park with the dead man's last message in his coat against his heart. The Duke took it to a physician of his own choosing, a careful old man with no love of Draxhall, who broke the wax and tested the cloudy liquid by the methods such men knew, and found in it digitalis in a quantity no honest physic would ever contain. He swore it before the young coroner. And the young coroner, holding now the dead man's own written suspicion, and the sealed vial, and the testimony of an honest physician, set the inquest for the Monday after the wedding and would not be moved, not by Draxhall money, not by Draxhall friends, not by the dowager's brittle threats, for his office was the only fortune he had, and he meant to keep it clean. The wedding was the Saturday. The inquest was the Monday. And in between stood the chapel at Draxhall and the whole assembled county, and a bride. On the morning of his wedding, Cyrus knew a great deal and one thing too few. The apothecary had recanted. The order book was burned. The girl had no proof a magistrate would credit. He did not know about the vial. It was the one thing that had slipped past him, because the dead man had hidden it from his own murderer in the last hours of his life. And so the Viscount of Draxhall dressed, believing he had won, and went down to the chapel a confident man. And that confidence was the trap the dead had laid for him. Sibella dressed too. The dowager had chosen the gown, a cream silk too fine for the girl's station, the better to display what Draxhall money could raise from the gutter, and Sibella let them dress her in it the way she had let them do everything, with a stillness they had long since stopped reading. They thought her broken. They thought the Thursday thread had done its work. She let them think it. It was the last advantage she had, and she meant to spend it at the chapel door. The county filled the Draxhall chapel under a high gray morning. The dowager sat in the front pew in diamonds, the picture of a triumph she had decided to enjoy. Cyrus stood at the altar in dark blue, handsome and warm and smiling, a man being given exactly what he had killed to be given. And at the back of the chapel in a pew, he had no right to, and a coldness no one dared question, sat the Duke of Avonhurst, who had come without invitation, and been too high in rank to turn away, and whose presence made the whole county murmur, for the houses had been at law for 30 years. Sibella came up the aisle on her cousin's arm, slow, in the cream silk, and the county watched the bankrupt's daughter raised so far above herself, and some pitied her and some envied her, and none of them knew that copied in pencil on the inside of her glove was an apothecary's entry, and that in the breast of the Duke at the back of the chapel was a young coroner's sealed order naming the inquest 2 days hence, and that, in a careful old physician's keeping, was a vial of cloudy brown liquid that her dead father had set aside with his own hand. She reached the altar. The clergyman opened his book. End. The familiar words began, the words that would make her the wife of the man who had poisoned her father by patient inches. And there came the place in the right where the clergyman asked whether any present knew just cause why these two should not be joined. The question every wedding asks, and no wedding expects to be answered. The chapel held its breath out of habit. And the Duke of Avonhurst rose. He did not shout. He had never in his life raised his voice, and he did not raise it now. He stood in his pew at the back of the chapel, tall and gray and still as stone over a river. And into the silence he spoke 6 words, level and clear, and carrying to the farthest pew the calibrated whole of everything he had spent 11 months earning the right to say. "I know just cause." He said he poisoned her father. The county did not breathe. Cyrus turned from the altar, and for a single instant his smiling face showed the thing beneath it, the cold, quick calculation of a man counting what his enemy could possibly hold. And Sibella saw it, and so did the Duke. And so from her front pew did Lady Ophrya, whose chin came up like a struck thing. It was the dowager who recovered first, because she was the cleverest of them. She rose in her diamonds and she said, in the carrying voice that had cowed a county for 40 years, that this was an outrage, that the Duke of Avonhurst nursed a 30-year grudge over a boundary and would say anything to wound the house of Draxhall, that there was not a shred of proof in it. No, the spite of a defeated litigant and the giddy fancy of a portionless girl who had got above herself, and she demanded that the Duke be put out of the chapel and the right go on. And the county wavered, for the dowager was formidable, and the Duke was cold. And an accusation is only an accusation. Cyrus took up his mother's defense at once, smooth and wounded and warm, the injured bridegroom, and said that he had loved Edivane Quardine as a friend, that he had sent his own physician, out of that very love that the grief of the daughter had been turned by his enemies into a weapon against him. And he held out his hand to Sibella at the altar and called her his quiet wren and asked her, before the whole county, to come away from these wicked words and be his wife. And every eye in the chapel turned to the bride. This was the moment they had built for the Draxhalls, the moment when the broken, grateful girl in the cream silk would take the smiling hand, and the accusation would die, as the fancy of a defeated duke. The dowager had calculated it. Cyrus had calculated it. They had threatened her and watched her and dressed her, and they believed, both of them, that they knew exactly what she would do, because their script had worked everywhere it had ever been tried. Sibella looked at the offered hand. She looked at the smiling face above it, the warm face, the face that had sent fruit and grief and a doctor across a winter, and she did not faint, and she did not weep, and she did not take the hand. She drew off her right glove, slowly, in the held silence, and turned it inside out so the whole front pew could see the pencil on it. And she said, in a voice that did not shake, that on this glove was copied an order placed by the Viscount of Draxhall, 3 winters past. Lero, the apothecary of Chichester, for digitalis in a quantity no household could want, carried away across 3 winter months by a Draxhall groom a little at a time. Her father's heart had begun to race that very winter, after a doctor sent kindly by the house of Draxall had given him drops. On the night he died, a gentleman had called late in the rain and brought brandy, and left a third glass on the table. And her father, before he died, had set aside the vial of those drops with his own hand, and written upon it that his pulse was worse, not better, and that he would take no more. The chapel had gone from breathless to something colder. The county was listening now. Truly listening. The way a room listens when the shape of a thing is becoming visible. And then Sibella turned to the Duke at the back of the chapel, and she said the last of it, the part that turned an accusation into a reckoning. "That vial," she said, "is no longer in my father's cabinet. It is in the keeping of an honest physician who has tested it and sworn to what it holds. The coroner of this county has read my father's own words and ordered his grave opened, and the inquest sits on Monday." She paused, and she let the silence work as her father had taught her a good gardener lets the soil work. "You may put the Duke out of the chapel," she said to the dowager, "and you may finish the rite, and you may make me a Draxall wife. The inquest sits on Monday, all the same, and the vial will be opened whether I am a wife or a widow's charge, and I would rather hear the truth read aloud as a Quardine than buried again as a Drax." It was the dowager who broke first, and it was a small thing, the way the truly defeated always break in small things. She did not rage. The carrying voice simply stopped working. She looked at her son, one swift, sideways look. The look of a mother who has just understood that the story she believed about her own child was the wrong story, that the boundary and the boy's old grudge over an oak had bought a thing she had told herself it could not have bought. And the bright certainty went out of her face like a candle pinched between two fingers. She sat down. She did not finish the sentence she had begun. The diamonds at her throat went on, glittering and meant nothing now. And Cyrus, robbed in one stroke of his mother's defense, and his county's belief with a vial he had not known existed already sworn to, and a grave already ordered open, made the only choice a cornered man of his kind makes. He let the smile fall. He did not confess. Men like him never confess. But he turned from the altar and walked the length of his own chapel through the parting silent county, and out the door into the grey morning. And he was gone from the county before the inquest sat gone abroad, the way such men go, and the house of Draxall did not recover its standing in 3 generations. The rite was not finished. There was no wedding. Sibella Quardine stood at the altar in the cream silk that was too fine for her, a bride of no one, and felt in the great cold silence of the chapel the strangest thing she had felt in a long grieving year, which was that she was, for the first time since her father's death, entirely safe. The Duke of Avonhurst came up the aisle. Then he did not stride, and he did not hurry. He came the length of the chapel through the standing county to the altar where she stood, and he stopped before her at the proper distance, and the whole assembled county watched the coldest man in 3 counties look at the portionless girl they had all agreed to pity, and his still grey face did the thing none of them had ever seen it do. It softened the crack the width of a hair opened, and behind it was warmth, and grief, and something that had been waiting all that long year for permission. "Miss Quardine," he said, and his low, level voice was not level now. Not quite. "Your father asked me in the last note he ever wrote what I made of those drops." He paused. "I have spent a long while making something of them. He told me once in his glass houses that you knew flowers better than any man he had taught." He was right. He stopped, and he seemed to gather himself, and then he said her given name for the first time, plainly as a marked and deliberate thing, the name no one at Draxall had ever used without an edge. "Sibella," he said, "will you let me take you out of this house?" It was not a proposal. It was something more careful than that, an offer of the door he had been holding for 11 months without daring to open it, and she understood it, and she understood, too, that everything she had earned the truth of, by her own hands and not by accident, that he had not rescued her, that they had pulled her father's killer down between them. Her knowledge and his patience, the daughter and the friend. She put her ungloved hand into his. They walked out of the Drexel Chapel together, the bankrupt's daughter and the cold Duke, into the grey Sussex morning. And behind them the county began at last to murmur the truth it had been so slow to see, and the murmur, when it found its shape, was on her side. The inquest sat on the Monday. The grave was opened with all the gravity such a thing demands, and the careful physicians found in it what the vial had promised. And the coroner read aloud the truth of how Edivon Quardine had died, by patient poison across a winter, at the hand of the friend who held a note against his land. It was entered into the record of the county, and the name of Quardine was cleared of the small whispered shames that bankruptcy and pity had hung upon it, and the daughter sat through all of it straight-backed and dry-eyed, because the speaking was the thing she had wanted, more even than the safety. The simple speaking aloud of what had been done in the dark. Mr. Hessam wept again, as he had wept at the sale. But it was a different weeping. The apothecary of Chichester, freed of his fear by the man's flight, swore his statement after all. And the Dowager Viscountess of Drexel, who had built her whole life on the order her son had defiled, was neither destroyed nor mocked. She withdrew to the dower house at the far edge of the estate and was seen at no more assemblies. And in time, it was said by those who had once feared her that she had grown quiet, and that on the rare occasions she spoke of her son it was as of a stranger, which was its own slow correction, and harder perhaps than any the county could have given her. There was a winter, and then there was a spring. Sibella did not marry the Duke of Avonhurst in haste, and he did not ask her to, for they were neither of them people who hurried the things that mattered. She lived that winter as the guest of his widowed aunt at Avonhurst Park, properly and without scandal, and in the cold months she walked the great, neglected glass houses of the estate, which had stood empty since the Duke's mother died, and began, almost without deciding to bring them back. She raised seedlings on the long benches her father would have known how to keep. The Duke found her there often, in the warmed green damp among the young plants, and stood in the doorway and watched her work, and the watching was a courtship more honest than any he could have spoken. They married in the spring in the small grey church on Avonhurst land, with Mr. Hessam in the front pew in his best coat, and the careful old physician beside him, and no diamonds anywhere in the building. She wore a gown of soft green that she had chosen herself. There was no county to perform for, only the two of them and the few who had earned the right to be there, and the spring light coming grey gold through the old plain glass. On the long bench in the chief glass house at Avonhurst Park, in the months that followed, there grew a row of seedlings that Sibella tended with a particular care, raised from seed she had carried out of Lindenrow in the week of the sale, in her grief, with nowhere else to put it. They were her father's own strain, a thing he had bred and named and never lived to see. Flower. She watered them in the warm green light with the patience he had taught her, and one morning in the second spring, the first of them opened, and she stood a long while looking at the bloom her father had made and never seen, and her husband came and stood beside her in the doorway and did not speak, and the warmth of the glass house held them both. And somewhere outside a thrush was singing in the grey-gold English morning, and the flower her father had reached for all his life was open, at last in his daughter's hands. Should you wish to linger a moment longer in the warmth of that glass house before you go, you might carry one small true thing away with you, that worth however long unseen is seen at the last by the one whose seeing matters.